Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Salisbury Forum. I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, the president. For those of you who are not familiar with the forum, we are based in the town of Salisbury in the northwest corner of Connecticut. We sponsor nationally recognized speakers in free public forums. We also sponsor 1 or 2 documentary film screenings each year. Go to our homepage at salisburyforum.org to watch videos of past talks. Get informed about upcoming events by joining our email list. On Thursday, October 1st at 7:30, Casper Chakile will be speaking on the future of community and spirituality. While this will be a departure from our typical talk, during this period of social isolation, his focus on community and connection will be particularly relevant for many of us. On Friday, November 20th at 7:30, our speaker will be Adam Gopnik. He's well known as an author and staff writer for The New Yorker. Well, he's written about an amazing diversity of topics over the years. Coming right after the election, his topic this time will be the end of the world, or the last faint hope. We've had a long-standing relationship with Oblong Books and Music, our wonderful independent local bookstore. As always, when our speakers are authors, they ensure that their books are available and have traditionally arranged for book signings at our events. Given that it's not possible right now, you can purchase signed copies of Kurt Andersen's current book, Evil Geniuses, The Unmaking of America, A Recent History, as well as some of his earlier books. You can get them both online and in their store. You may be interested in knowing that they will be hosting a free online event on Thursday, September 17th, focused on the book, They Said No to Nixon, Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuses of Power. The event requires registration, so you should go to Oblong's website for more details. While our presentations have gone virtual, we still incur most of the costs of our in-person lectures. We rely on contributions from our audience to continue our mission of providing free programs that are interesting and provocative. We're very grateful for any contribution you can make. For the Q&A this evening, click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions you may have. Do not put your questions into the chat box. A brief poll will pop up right after Kurt and his interviewer, Jim Kelly, finish their discussion. As soon as you respond, we will move on to the Q&A. Anyway, we're very pleased to have Kurt Andersen with us tonight. He co-founded Spy Magazine and co-created and hosted Studio 360, a weekly radio show and podcast about art and pop culture that aired from 2000 to this year. He's also a journalist. Formerly, he was a New Yorker columnist and staff writer, Time Magazine critic and columnist, and editor-in-chief of New York Magazine. He writes as well for television, film, and the stage. His website is one of the best I've ever seen and gives you access to much of his past work. So I want to make a shout out to his daughter who designed it. She did a great job. I highly recommend his best-selling book, Fantasyland, which is a fascinating look into our culture. His new book, Evil Geniuses, has just been published and is already on the New York Times bestseller list. And by the way, Kurt, happy birthday for tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Kurt will be interviewed tonight by Jim Kelly, who is the book's editor for the online weekly newsletter Airmail and is best known as the former editor of Time Magazine. So welcome, Kurt and Jim. You now have the floor and I will disappear.
Thanks, Mary.
Well, thank you, Mary. By the way, my birthday is in December, so just. Well, I'm delighted to be here tonight with Kurt to talk about his new book and the inflection points of 1980 and 2020. In this Sunday's New York Times, Kurt's book receives a rockingly good review, with the reviewer calling Evil Geniuses essential, absorbing, infuriating, full of facts you didn't know, and saxophonally written. Saxophonally written. I can't think of a better compliment. And it's already on the New York Times bestseller list. It debuts at number 7, which is a very lucky number indeed. Now, it would be foolhardy for anyone to try to summarize the richness of Kurt's book, but I'm going to be that fool tonight, and I'm going to try. Kurt's thesis, by and large, is that for decades after the New Deal, America had it good. It became a fairer and more evenly prosperous country. with a growing middle class, more opportunity for more people, and a provable belief that you could create a better life for you and your children. That all began to crack apart in the 1970s as the New Deal gave way to what Kurt calls in his book, The Raw Deal, producing much greater economic disparity and the diminishment of hope for a better life. Today, in so many ways, so many Americans are not just not better off than 20 years ago, they're worse off in all the ways that once made us as a country feel optimistic and creative and eager to take risk. The idea of American specialness, that we are fairer and more egalitarian and more compassionate than people in other countries, has been tarnished by the greed and the corruption and the selfishness of what Kurt calls evil geniuses. So, Kurt.
Sure.
Who are these evil geniuses?
I can't tell. No. The evil geniuses, I didn't start thinking, oh, this is going to be some kind of group biography of these guys. And by the way, they're all guys. And of course, it's a story. But then I found that there were these recurring characters, these key characters. Milton Friedman, Charles Koch and his brother David, other rich right-wing billionaires, a guy called Grover Norquist, who became the key anti-tax enforcer for the right in Washington. So many various CEOs who formed this thing called the Business Roundtable in the early 70s, which was a whole new kind of lobbying group by the 200 largest corporations of a kind that really had never existed. There had been the Chamber of Commerce, but nothing like this. There's a whole bunch of them. And some of them are well known, like Charles Koch or Milton Friedman, and some of them are lesser known, but they worked in concert. I'm not, as you know, you've read the book, I'm not suggesting that they were a group of conspiracists who met every 2 weeks in a dark room, but various groups of them did meet every week or two in various rooms, and there was an orchestrated strategy, which I just never, at the time it was happening, when I was a teenager and then a young person, a young adult, I just thought all of the changes in our economy and our economic system and this concentration on profits above all and everything else, I thought it just happened more or less. I just wasn't aware until I went back and did this sort of forensic post-mortem, how deliberate and orchestrated it all was. It didn't just happen. It was re-engineered.
And it's also the way they managed to take over the political system, which was so interesting. But you know what's interesting to me is, for example, you mentioned Jack Welch, who ran General Electric for many, many years. When you think about evil geniuses, you don't necessarily think about Jack Welch, but as you point out, he in fact is responsible for part of the dismantling of what might be called the American dream.
Yeah, well, he turned, among other things, I mean, he was very successful for a while at increasing GE's stock price. And increasing the stock price when he was CEO, became CEO in the 1980s, at that time became, as it never had been before, the single measure of, is this company successful or not? Period. End of story. Rather than how are they doing about building for the future? Are their customers happy? Are they innovating? All those other things that companies are supposed to have done. This single metric became everything, and he was very good at that. For instance, well, he did a couple of things that I'll mention that are part of the transformation. He pioneered this corporate culture and rule by which 10% of his employees were fired each year, the 10% lowest performing according to the consensus of their superiors. And so 1 out of 10 people every year, good or bad, they were judged the worst and would be thrown out. So one of the things that I hadn't realized, and this is just one example of how insecurity, the sense of, my God, am I going to be laid off any day? And along with the end of fixed pensions and the unreliability of and unaffordability of healthcare, all of these added to the sense of insecurity that so much of the American system that you talked about after the New Deal was about creating a sense of security so that from there people could work well and make great things and run companies well. So he did that, which was then copied by, many other big companies with all
of which called,
what?
isn't it? Very famous. He had it was called the Sigma 5, I believe.
Yes.
And it was this plan that other companies took to heart, and then of course, he had his comeuppance by slowly changing GE into a financial services firm. But it's fascinating to me because Welch is not normally considered. I mean, in his heyday, he was considered a much admired individual by Democrats, Republicans, even though he's Republican, obviously. But it was very interesting to me that he. I hadn't made the connection of him to others. Now, other evil geniuses include, for example, Chuck Schumer, who you point out, along with several other politicians. Maybe he's a semi-evil genius.
They were the flying monkey minions of the evil.
Oh, okay. But for example, he has been one of the strongest supporters of the outrageous, I think, pass-through tax advantage that hedge funds get and others. And of course, he, along with some other Democratic legislators, 5-10 years ago, were among the best beneficiaries of all this money given by the hedge funds and all that. But let me ask you this: 1980 is justifiably an inflection point. And its most, notable reason, of course, is the election of Ronald Reagan. But were there other things that were happening at that time that made 1980 so significant?
It did, and it became clear in a lot of ways, and certainly as I look back at that history, how many things changed. First of all, the economic right, my evil geniuses, were working up to that from 1970. So right. It wasn't just, we elected Ronald Reagan, hurrah, taxes are low, trickle down, supply side is here. They were building institutions, and moreover, and more importantly, and this is why it wasn't a big reason why it was an inflection point, changing the way the chattering class, the elite, and public sentiment thought about the market and profits, and that of course profits have always been important, and we are a free market economy, but the degree to which they changed opinion to make those things sort of eclipse all other values, that wasn't just a organic paradigm shift. That was pursued. So that was one of the inflection points. Also in the 70s, there had been discombobulating economic facts of raging inflation, the oil price hikes brought about by OPEC and so forth. So it wasn't as though it was happy sailing, but it was not, for instance, the Great Depression or, for instance, the pandemic crisis economically we're now facing. So that helped bring about the inflection point, but helped because the people who wanted to change the way we thought about what fairness ought to be, and again, this New Deal consensus that had existed since our parents' youth, to roll that back and change that. And so that was really the inflection point. The other thing I talk about, as you know, in the book is this plunge into nostalgia that Americans did, right? Really after the late 60s, through the 70s and into the 80s, that everything in the old days was better. And let's make movies and TV shows and write books about the past, because the past was so much better. Now nostalgia is a thing. Americans have always indulged bits of nostalgia, but it had never been such an all-encompassing plunge as it became in the 70s and 80s. And the evil geniuses took great advantage of it. I mean, all of us who were around at the time remember the amazing Morning in America ad. Right. That was I think the best ad in political history, probably one of them anyway, that helped get Reagan reelected in 1984, which sort of made the present day look like the olden times, and this is what Ronald Reagan had given you. And that's really how, that was the other part of what I think was this inflection point of instead of looking forward and celebrating the new and seeking the new and as America had always done, we just, let's look back.
Right. No, I was going to mention that, yes, you point out that as you studied this time politically and economically, you noticed that the culture had become surprisingly static. You want to talk a little more about I know the 60s and 70s, they were, many different things happened, but I would argue that that you could use as many examples of where the culture was moving away from nostalgia as you could with nostalgia. But I suppose that you feel it worked politically more than, say, the Talking Heads did.
Well, I think it was all of it was a, as Warren Buffett later called it in the early 2000s, a class war. And like all wars, it had many fronts and many different operations and many different kinds of fighting going on. And using this sinking into nostalgia as successfully was one of them. But what do you mean, Jim, when you say that you're suggesting we weren't all about nostalgia, that there was all kinds of new stuff happening as well?
Well, I thought that, for example, in the 50s and the 60s, there were all these Western shows summoning up a nostalgia for, well, in fact, you had Ronald Reagan being the host for, several years, the Dead Valley days.
Yeah.
So I think that you could argue that you could pick any point in time and discover enough examples in which there's some evidence of yearning for the past. But
sure.
TV, the examples you mentioned, like Happy Days, I mean, these were big mega hits, and none of them were particularly, it was all about the past. Happy Days, in fact, is a perfect name for summing up what people missed.
Well, crucially, and it did begin with this sort of nostalgia mania for the 1950s and early 60s, whether it was American Graffiti, Happy Days, Sha Na Na, Grease. And that was the first, in a big way, this plunge into nostalgia. And what was that about? It was about just a few years ago, essentially, at the time, right? It was 1969, 70, 71, 72. They were pining for 10 years earlier, which is a crazy new form of nostalgia, right? And I don't think it's accidental that it was when things were calm. It was before the Vietnam War and so forth. It was also, however, before civil rights and before feminism and before women coming into the workplace. So even though people may not have said, "Oh yeah, I like Happy Days because it celebrates the stable patriarchy and white dominated America," but I think that was part of what was going on.
I think that's fair. Also in the 80s, the 80s and the Reagan 80s began to generate their own kind of TV fantasies like Dynasty and those other shows that so much celebrated.
Well, and in so many ways, as I talk about in the book, I mean the normalization of ostentation, of wealth and secondarily celebrity being the be all and end all of what every American wants to acquire, that happened too at this same time. I mean, again, I don't want to be too nostalgic myself for how great life was in the 50s and 60s. Women and people of color were oppressed, yes, but economically it was a lot better before this shift happened. And as I say, it didn't just happen. And I see it as to me as appalling and surprising and infuriating as the reviewer said, and somewhat depressing as this history is. It gives me hope that if it was re-engineered this way in our lifetime, it can be engineered back the other way. So and to make us more like some of our peer countries, most of our peer countries in the rich world who do this much better.
We'll get into that in a minute, but I want to talk about also. You had two terms of Bill Clinton and 2 terms of Barack Obama, both Democrats, both of them you would think running and winning on the promise that they would make America more egalitarian, and spread the wealth better. But as you also pointed out, in the 80s themselves, the Democrats often helped the Republicans with the tax cuts and all that. So there was at some point in the 80s, everyone, Republican and Democrat, loves a tax cut. If you're talking about cutting services, that's where things become very, very different. And you talk a little bit about how you feel both President Clinton and President Obama didn't quite accomplish what they might have accomplished.
Well, and it didn't just start with Clinton. I mean, the New Democrats who became the Democratic Party starting in the 1970s with Gary Hart and Bill Bradley and all the rest were basically abandoned the FDR idea of economic equality, right? And Gary Hart literally ran against that. It's the end of the New Deal. The things that worked back then don't work now. And so Bill Clinton was just the sort of apotheosis of that. And in so many ways, again, I was part of that. I mean, I didn't run for office. I didn't work in Washington, but I was all down with that as a quote unquote neoliberal at the time. So did
you ever work for an evil genius?
Did I, Jim? Yes. Well, one evil genius in particular, and he is a guy called Henry Kravis, who is a billionaire and one of the people who helped transform the finance industry from the kind of boring, helpful, ancillary part of the economy that it was to this, as I call the chapter about that whole process of financialization, how Wall Street ate America. And he, by being a pioneer of leveraged buyouts and using junk bonds to take over companies and stuff, certainly was an evil genius. And not just because he fired me from my job as editor of New York Magazine.
Well, we should talk about the fact that when you were at SPY, the magazine wrote about Henry Kravis, and not to put too fine a point on it, but some of the things SPY magazine said about Henry Kravis was tiny 80s relic Henry Kravis, dwarfish takeover maniac Henry Kravis, and my favorite is after he bought Nabisco, his KKR bought Nabisco, shredded wheat king Henry Kravis. Now, Henry Kravis, of course, happened to buy the company that published New York Magazine at around the time you became the editor. As you point out in your book, thank God there was no Google then, because if he Googled you, you never would have gotten the job. But again, Henry Kravis was a big Republican. Again, I come back to how come Bill Clinton and how come Barack Obama didn't manage to write this course, and you would argue not bring Donald Trump.
Because starting in the 70s and through the 80s and 90s and into the aughts, there was no serious economic left in the vicinity of power in the United States, which is to say in the Democratic Party. Whatever version of the British Labour Party the Democratic Party could or should have been or was, it certainly was in the FDR's time, it ceased to be. Basically, most Democratic leaders decided, well, we don't really disagree with the Republicans. Yeah, we want a bit higher taxes, and we certainly want not to destroy welfare, and we believe in social programs a little more. But economically, as opposed to questions of cultural questions and racial questions and the rest, economically, the Democrats effectively decided, nah, we don't really disagree. You know, they basically turned themselves into the last living liberal Republicans after there were no more liberal Republicans. Do you know? So that's why they didn't, because they didn't see it as their mission. They didn't believe it. They really believed that the market, you know, with a nudge here or there maybe from the government, was how problems were solved and how the economy was made better and how jobs were created and all the rest.
You know, we will not spend much time talking about Donald Trump because he's already, I would say, a well-discussed subject. But one of the interesting things about in the book was, you know, to the extent that Donald Trump has parlayed divisiveness to his political advantage, plus a yearning for a time when America was great, thus make America great again, its own kind of nostalgia hat trick, so to speak. But you discovered that Barry Goldwater in 1964, his campaign had a wonderfully eccentric half-hour video about basically, do you want the old days or do you want the new good days, or rather the bad new days or the good old days? Can you talk a little bit about that video, which I think very few people have seen?
Yeah, and it's highly available on the internet. I would encourage people to go watch it, especially if whether they were around at the time or not. It's a half-hour film that they made, that his members of his campaign made, that was saying, it was basically in this hyperbolic culture war way. It was like the first depiction of what we now, almost 60 years later, 56 years later, know as the culture war. But it was saying, look at these young people, look at these black people out in the streets singing or protesting. Look at this, topless dancers and pornography, all of it. Look at these drugs coming over Mexico from the Mexican border, all like hitting every, touchstone of the culture war that has been so successful politically for the right in 1964. What's interesting is it failed. I mean, Barry Goldwater had the biggest landslide loss in popular vote still in American history, because there were no hippies yet. There were no black uprisings in the city yet. There was no, all of the discombobulation that happened in the late 60s and continued for a little while hadn't happened yet. So there was no political gain from making this hysterical argument that the old-fashioned, church-going, white, rule-obeying America is gone, because it wasn't happening yet in a very visible way in 1964. And of course, and Barry Goldwater at the last second himself pulled that back, that film, and it was going to be on NBC one night all around the country. And he said, nah, I'm pulling it back, because that really wasn't his thing. He was a Milton Friedmanite. He wanted to wipe away the New Deal.
But to quote from the video we've been talking about, the narration is quite something, because the narrator says, now there are two Americas. The other America is no longer a dream, but a nightmare. Our streets are not safe. Immorality begins to flourish. We don't want this. The new America asks not what you can give, but what you can take. Interesting. Illegitimate births swell the relief rolls. There's the cancer of pornography festering. This half-hour video focuses a lot on pornography for some reason,
yes.
which was someone's fear.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about 2020 as an inflection point. You're cautiously optimistic, I would say, that somehow out of what's happened the last 40 years and out of everything from the pandemic to the way progressives have been winning races around the country, to the outpouring of anger with Black Lives Matter, that out of this crisis can come something truer to the American ideal of fairness and equality and a much better distributed prosperity. You want to talk about why you feel that?
Sure. I mean, so I think, well, one thing is I have always had a certain weakness for sort of cyclical or cyclical, if that's the way the word is pronounced, theories of history. And so we had the progressive and the New Deal era for 50 years. And then we had this raw deal era, which is, if let's say 50 years is the shelf life, we're coming on that. So that's one thing, not dispositive in my argument. But I also think that the fact that the supply side idea, we just cut taxes for the rich, keep taxes insanely low for the rich, and get rid of regulation as much as we can. It'll make great jobs, the economy will boom. Well, that just hasn't happened. The economy, yes, has grown for the last 40 years, but only the top 20% and most extremely the top 1% have enjoyed the benefits of that. Whereas in the past, as the economy grew, as productivity grew, I mean, you look at the charts, all boats rose. I mean, there were still poor people and middle-class people and rich people, but the lines of their respective wealth and incomes kept kept growing. So I think people are beginning to see that. And I look back recently at Donald Trump's final campaign ad in 2016. It was extraordinary because it had his narration blaming Wall Street and the bankers for destroying America's working class and ripping off, destroying America. It could have been Bernie Sanders delivering this. I swear to God. And so the fact that he, in his way, he did campaign on this, then of course he gets elected and doesn't govern anything like that. But I think the fact that he understood in his lizard brain way, brilliant way, that was a way to get elected, and it worked. So I think the last decade we have seen these issues of, oh, it's a rigged system, and all the various versions of that, whether Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, or Donald Trump saying such things. I think there is more popular sentiment that that's true. I was given hope that I never thought Andrew Yang was going to get a nomination, but the fact that the idea of what are we going to do in the future when the machines take all the jobs? Well, maybe some kind of universal basic income. The fact that got a respectable hearing earlier this year was great. So I see that. I see that the ideas are percolating. Then, as you say, the crisis, the pandemic crisis, that's when change happens. The New Deal obviously came out of the Depression. This change in the 80s came out of the more moderate crises of the 70s. And so the two things combined give me some hope. I mean, talk to me in 3 months. Either those green shoots of hope will have grown or not.
Well, I hope you're right. I'm a little less optimistic than you are. Whatever one may think of Joe Biden, and I happen to like him, he is the least innovative of the candidates in the field, for better or for worse. He now has the nomination. You point out that it often takes a charismatic leader to execute change, and you blame Jimmy Carter for not being that. I'm not calling Joe Biden Jimmy Carter, but we'll see. What it seems clear to me is if in fact Joe Biden does win the election, he is a transitional figure. I mean, we're not going to have years and years of Joe Biden. And my fear is that the pandemic has done two things. It's laid bare, even before, more so than ever, the disparities in this country. But I'm not so sure there will be the money and the willpower to fix that.
Well,
Now,
we'll see. But to the money and to the Democrats always being in a position of cleaning up after the fiscal disasters that the Republicans wrought, happened with Clinton after Reagan, happened with Obama after George W. Bush, and it will happen to some degree with Biden after this. And what I was surprised to find, among many things I was surprised to find, is that was part of the plan. Irving Kristol said in 1970 in the Wall Street Journal, we're not going to be these fiscal hawks anymore. If we make a mess by being our new kinds of conservatives, meaning just radically lowering taxes, then the Democrats and the liberals will clean up for us afterwards. That was the plan, and that's how it's gone down.
well, it's a big cleanup because the Journal, I think today, had a story about how the national debt now is actually greater than the actual economy. I mean, in terms of dollars. So, and that's pretty scary. I think we have some questions. And I just wonder if, Mary, would it be easier for you to handle the questions?
Thank you, first of all, both of you. First, I'm going to have our poll come up.
Oh, yes.
And, just to ask people to please answer these two short questions. And as soon as we're done with that, then I will turn things back to you, Jim, to ask the questions. So if people will just please respond to the poll. We're curious about where you live, if you're coming new to us and if you're local or not, and also how you heard about this webinar. So I'll just leave this up for a couple of minutes.
Jim, I want you to sing that Jeopardy theme song. Oh, I didn't know anyone could hear me. Sorry.
No, that's great. I think it's great background for our poll.
Excellent.
Okay, so I think most of the people who are going to respond have already responded. Almost everybody is from Litchfield County, which is interesting, and the vast majority of people heard about our talk from our emails. So thank you very much for participating in that. And so now.
And just for the record, Litchfield Countyites, that's where I've spent the last 6 months as well. So I'm there among you.
Yeah, and then, and I think, Jim, you're in Roxbury. That's not Litchfield,
I'm in Roxbury, and I love it here, but I loved it before the pandemic, so.
Okay. Anyway, feel free. Yeah, everyone, I hope you will start writing in your questions.
Oh, okay. Very good question. Is Warren Buffett an evil genius?
Very good question. He is one of the very few billionaires I know personally, because I grew up in Omaha, and of course he's an Omahan. No, he's not. And I call him out as proof that just being a billionaire doesn't make you evil, although he is a genius, of course. But I've admired him. My admiration for him has not changed as I got deeper into this book and became a more, I don't know, I became more and more skeptical and appalled about how the economy has been changed. No, and one of the ways in which he's not an evil genius, he said in 2005 and 2006, and it got quite a bit of attention at the time, but it was sort of taken as a joke. And I really think it's true. He said, because people were saying, oh, these lefty Democrats are having this class war talk. And he said on 2 different occasions, once, amusingly, to Lou Dobbs, back when Lou Dobbs was being a populist on CNN, Warren Buffett said, there is a class war, and it's my people. It's the rich class who have been waging it, and we're winning, and we shouldn't be. So now, which isn't to say and of course, around that same time, or certainly in the early part of this century, he decided to give his tens of billions of dollars away in his lifetime. So, I don't think that we want a country that depends on the kindness of billionaires to give their money away. But Warren Buffett is an exception, and definitely not an evil genius. Also, his approach to investment is famously investing in things for the long term, not trading and piling on unsustainable debt and just getting rich, and the whole way that the financialization of the economy happened. Warren Buffett has not done that, and has been very, very successful, obviously, not doing that. So no, he's the counterexample.
Both Clinton and Obama had to mostly deal with the conservative Republican Congress. Do you think what would they have done if they did not get reined in on change, do you think?
Well, Obama, I looked back, for instance, in detail that I hadn't at the time really paid it close enough attention to, back to when Obama was first elected, and his big move, obviously, was the Affordable Care Act and trying to make healthcare more universal and affordable. At the beginning, when he went out, along with the AFL-CIO, we're putting forth a public option, which is to say, Medicare available to anybody who wants it. That was as radical. That was pretty radical at the time, but the Obama administration was there until the months passed, and they abandoned that. So yes, they had obstructionist Republican Congress. They also had for a brief time in his first couple of years, a 60 vote majority in the Senate. So I do think, I think people like Lawrence Summers and these Wall Street Wall Street bred economic team that he had, like Clinton had, as they have been criticized for having a excessively Wall Street friendly view of how the economy ought to work. And I think probably Obama didn't try to do anything more progressive, more bigger, because of that kind of compromising posture, which also, as I say, had been the Democratic posture, capital D Democratic posture, for 2 generations at that point.
Kurt, it's interesting. There's a good question here about how wealthy conservatives put a lot of money into foundations, institutions, all these things that, as you point out in your book, help foment this the kind of culture we've had the last 40 years. Liberals, not so much. Is that a failure of imagination? Or if liberals are going to have the kinds of institutions like the Heritage Foundation that so much fueled the ranks of administration officials during the Reagan and Bush administrations, and the Bush administration for that matter, the second Bush administration, is that critical, or is that just the way it is?
I think it's again, one of the things I realized after writing this history is that people on my side of the fence can look back at how this was done and learn a lot of lessons, including think tanks that aren't kind of mushy, middle of the road liberal, and those have come to be. There are several influential good ones. So that is happening, has been for the last 10 or 15 years, as it happened on the right in the 1970s. There's now Thomas Piketty, the French economist whose book Capital sold millions of copies, amazingly. Paul Krugman, Joe Stiglitz. We now have, the left, the economic left now has its star economists, like the right had Milton Friedman and Hayek and the rest. So I see some mirror images happening, but no, I think those things are important. And I think one of the things that I realized was this slightly, not naive sounding, but hoity-toity sounding idea that ideas have power and ideas can change history. But because it's supposed to be, that's supposed to be too earnest and Pollyannish. But this history of evil geniuses shows that ideas, along with extreme selfishness and lust for power in the case of business and rich people, but ideas, these libertarian ideas, which were out on the fringe, until the 70s, really, were believed, pursued, operationalized, and voila, the world was changed. So yeah, you need all those things. You need institutions, you need think tanks, and the rest. And partly I think liberals felt, oh, we do. The right is correct. We really do run the culture and the media and that was true. And so there was a complacency that existed as I think, as I say, as Democrats in terms of economics became liberal Republicans over the decades and really gave up the idea that, for instance, as FDR said in 1944 or maybe 1936, one of these great economic speeches of his, he said, he's talking about unreasonable profits. And I saw that as I was reading those speeches, I thought, man, even the idea of unreasonable profits became a null set. We just don't even think in terms of that anymore. And so those kinds of ideas that we see more and more, certainly among younger Americans in their embrace of progressive economic ideas, it may not. We'll see where as you say, where Joe Biden goes. Joe Biden, however, to your point about he is what he is, as Barack Obama or as Michelle Obama and quoting Donald Trump said the other day, but he is also a guy who has always gone and will go as president where his party is going. And his party on economics and other ways has moved very much to the left in the last decade, and he's not going to stay behind. I mean, he's saying now public option on healthcare that's the moderate position that he is all for. Well, as I said, a dozen years ago, that was the whoa, too left for us to pursue position of the Obama administration.
Here's thank you. There's a very good question here about trade unions, and that is, can trade unions somehow be brought back to have this the strong power they had back in the 40s and 50s? My feeling is that that's just simply not possible, because the way the worker economy has changed, and as you point out, with robots, it's hard to have a union of robots. It's hard to have a union in a gig economy. And I don't think unions can ever be as strong a gang as they were 40 years ago. I think, as you point out in the book, a key moment in our history here was how Ronald Reagan handled the air traffic controllers. And that was kind of an important moment about how people felt about trade unions. Do you want to? Do you disagree, Kurt, or do you think the trade unions can?
No, I think that the openness to organized labor in various forms and empowerment of workers in various forms, whether it's the surprising, what seemed improbable 5-6 years ago, $15 an hour minimum wage, is now done in a majority in terms of in states that have a majority of the population, and in some cities higher. So that's one way at the bottom of the economic ladder to empower workers. But there are ways to empower workers beyond the trade union movement. And by the way, as you know, I spent a whole chapter comparing in every way, brief, succinctly, but in all these ways, the United States to the rest of the rich world. Why is it that the 7% of private sector workers in the United States belong to unions, whereas it's still 25, 35, 55, 75% in other countries? Well, because they didn't have their evil geniuses who destroyed unions. And moreover, they have unions in the Nordic countries, for instance, who cooperate with business and government to not fight to the death for a given job or a given technology, but work together for the prosperity of all. So whether it's trade unions getting back I think the answer is it's or other things. It's other kinds of federal and state legislation and various kinds of figuring out ways to empower workers. Because if you don't, we get to a really feudal state, and as I described, with the advance of AI and I don't think this industrial revolution of computers and automation as it continues is going to be like the last ones, where there's going to be all these new jobs and it'll be fun, it'll all sort itself out. Well, it hasn't sorted itself out in the last 30 years. And all the experts say it's not going to sort itself out. There aren't going to be enough jobs. So whether it's through trade unions or other means, there needs to be a balance restored between the power of big business and the power of their employees.
Good. Mary, do you want to add something?
Sorry. Hi. There are still some more questions in the question thing. If you want to ask those, I don't. I'll do is sort of close up when you both are finished. So.
Okay. Well,
well, those are great questions so far. So if there are any other great ones, I'll answer.
Is there a Bastille Day reckoning coming?
Is that a question, or are you just saying that?
No, that's a question, and I think I can hear the. If I hear the tumbrils in Roxbury, I'll let you know.
Well, that's the thing, right? When you look back at Franklin Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt, both of them were rich guys, right? Who understood that their fellow rich people and patricians and nouveau riche people were destroying the good thing we had going, the particular free market golden goose we had. And they both, in their various ways, Franklin and the New Deal most of all, led a movement to rejigger American capitalism, to be sustainable, to be fair, to work. So, that's the thing, that this kind of evil genius greed and getting too much power against the rest of us is not sustainable. And so therefore, you know, Bastilles and pitchforks, or whatever the modern equivalent of pitchforks and torches are. Yeah, we could get there. We could become Venezuela, or you know, pick your bad outcome if we don't figure out a way to make this an economic system that works for most people instead of only the people who live in, you know, Roxbury, Jim.
I'm rephrasing this question from another viewer a little bit. I hope he doesn't mind. Is how come the Silicon Valley billionaires don't seem to have gotten involved so overtly in politics as other kinds of billionaires?
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting question because and I have a lot of reasons for that. One, the original one, in a certain sense, Steve Jobs, and I talk about him in the book, famously just didn't care. He didn't believe in politics, didn't care. He just wanted to do his cool thing and make a lot of money and change the world. And he did. So there's that tradition of kind of apolitical feeling. Also, they, like him, consider themselves, and this is a term that emerged in the 70s, socially liberal but fiscally conservative, which of course means keep taxes on me low, but you know, do whatever you want. Be gay. You know, I love people of all races. I don't see color. I'm liberal. I'm socially liberal, but you know, no big social programs, no high taxes on me. So that's part of it. In the case of Mark Zuckerberg and the people who run Google, they both are monopolies. I mean, they are monopolies, and so that's what antitrust law was invented in America in the 1890s to stop, and evolved and enforced until in the 70s and 80s, our evil geniuses figured out how to emasculate and eviscerate antitrust. So, by the way, so they are not. We don't yet have. Well, Peter Thiel actually is a digital guy who is a right-wing activist.
The exception that proves the rule, though.
Pardon me?
The exception that proves the rule.
Yeah,
I mean, he's
but most of them are a little less ideologically zealous than you know, the Kochs and the other types who are among my evil geniuses.
Well, since we're heading into an election, there's a question here about the Democrats sought to get money from some of the evils. Money needs politicians to change attitudes. So, I mean, we all know how much money is controlling our government at this point, and both Democrat and Republican legislators. So where does that fit into the whole evil genius thing? And then if you, the politicians are so beholden to keep on dialing for dollars and raising money. And they're going to go to the richest people to get that money.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And again, I didn't know because I wasn't paying close enough attention, and I wasn't the editor of Time magazine like Jim was. But the way in which lobbying just by an order of magnitude increased during the 80s and 90s, and as a result, of course, federal campaigns for Congress and the presidency doubled and tripled and quadrupled, which meant they needed more money, which meant money became more and more, and as you say, dialing for dollars became more part of the thing. And yes, when you are getting big donations from socially liberal but fiscally conservative Wall Street guys, you're going to be sympathetic to their wish for a much lower tax rate on the pass-through income that they pretend isn't income, but rather capital gains. And if you're Chuck Schumer or, frankly, Hillary Clinton or Connecticut's senators at the time, you're gonna say, well, okay, I'm not gonna push that too much. And that's what happens, and that's unfortunate. And unfortunately, the evil geniuses of the economic right got Citizens United decision passed by having become so powerful in the judiciary as part of their plan, their evil plan through the Federalist Society. and got Citizens United passed, which made most campaign finance regulation unconstitutional. So it's hard, and it may be undoable. Jim, your pessimism may be correct. I mean, it's a hard thing to fix, to do this, to wage this counter revolution, if you will. But you know, it's tough. But again, and we see people, you know, various candidates getting hundreds of millions of dollars from small donors. So I think enough people are fed up enough and are beginning to see this vision of what happened and how it could be different. And once again, as the father of two very active daughters, adult daughters, I extrapolate to the rest of their generation, and I think that that's what gives me hope, I guess, is that, you know, we are at an inflection point. We are and when Andy Grove, the great founder of Intel, popularized the phrase inflection point, he said, you know, it's the point at which, for a variety of reasons, a company, or in our case, a country, gets to a point where you're in a death spiral, or you can rise to new heights. We really, really are at that point. We were, you know, I finished this book, most of this book, before the pandemic, and I was talking about this inflection point, and what's happened in the last 6 months has just upped that ante and raised those stakes and made us more at an inflection point. And I really do think, I mean, November 3rd is just the beginning and the first step for whether it's spiraling further down or beginning the long, hard climb back to, you know, the America that was fairer and more just economically 40, 50 years ago.
Do you,
I should point out, by the way, that Kurt, people can write in Kurt's name in the presidential in November. Just spell Andersen correctly. So, Mary, did you have another question, or?
Yeah, I see a question here. It's a little bit of a detour, but it's, how do you see climate change and the fear of global warming and all that fitting into this scenario of an inflection point? And how do you see that fitting in?
Well, of course it does, because, and whether, you know, depending on what forecast you look at, and how dire the consequences of doing nothing are. Do we have a year? Do we have 10 years? Do we have 20 years? Yes, we are at an inflection point on that. And again, I spend time in Evil Geniuses talking with memos, these memos that exist, which are just, each one of them was jaw-dropping to me. These memos about climate change, these memos starting in the late 80s by the Petroleum Trade Association, by Republican pollsters, by ExxonMobil, saying, okay, this, you know, after climate change, global warming had, during the 80s actually, become this conventional wisdom, and Republicans wanted to solve it with government programs and interventions as much as Democrats. And then the evil geniuses made the call, no, we don't want to do that. So all of these memos said, we have to start casting doubt on the science of climate change, about which there was no fundamental doubt. And so they did it. And once again, I think you saw, in terms of the response to the pandemic, the focus of the Trump administration and of the Koch entities like FreedomWorks and Americans for Prosperity from the get-go, from February of this year. It was all about, no, we can't close down. We've got to get things open again. The stock market has to be, you know, we've got to keep it high. So this privileging of profits and stock prices and that, you know, over public health and planetary health, whether it's in the case of the pandemic or of beginning the long fight to lower carbon emissions, it's just plain to me. And again, I was, as Jim knows, I mean, I was a centrist. I was a Democratic centrist. Oh, this is all going fine. I'm doing fine. It'll work itself out. And I came to see that isn't true, and that there's been this just pattern of reckless selfishness, given this kind of righteous packaging. And seems to me it's, yeah. So yes, climate change is another way in which we don't have much time to start fixing it. So yeah, it's a high stakes, triple existential crisis moment.
It's very interesting to me because if you look at the pandemic, which of course is not climate change, but it is something happening to us that is not controllable. It is just as the wildfires are engulfing California. I mean, it's very hard not to see the consequences of climate change. Pandemic is like that. And yet I found it interesting how many people in the United States had to evolve towards wearing masks. And it only happened when, in fact, it happened to them. And even then there was some resistance. But you would think that given what happened to New York and Connecticut and New Jersey back in March, April, would have given states like Texas and Florida a heads up. California is its own special case because they did have a crackdown and they loosened up, and now it's rising again. So climate change may in fact be embraced by more people in the coming years as it basically affects them in ways that it didn't 10, 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Right. Look at the numbers, look at the survey numbers about Americans and what they think about climate change. Same with the pandemic. Gigantic majorities, 70% of Americans think that climate change, global warming is a crisis that we need to address. Same percentages think, no, I care more about solving this public health crisis and mitigating it and preventing death than I do about the economics of it. So it is, I mean, another thing we begin to see in this pandemic is that it is this small group that is being noisy and recruiting non-billionaires to go to the streets and carry semi-automatic weapons and be angry about masks, So, but the great majority of people, just as the great majority of people have not benefited from the new economy since 1980, a great majority of people think climate change is a real serious crisis. Great majority of people think the way to deal with the pandemic is not to ignore it and make up miracle cures and just open schools helter-skelter,
Here's a good question, and it gets at, I think, a very important point, which is basically to realize the kinds of changes that you're proposing. It does require a stronger government. But for lots of reasons, people have lost faith in government and their politicians. How can our belief in government grow stronger again so government is empowered to do these sorts of things? That's a good question.
Oh, it's a great question. And of course, the double whammy of the Right's project over all these years is both, they're happy when the federal government does things incompetently. I mean, in a certain sense, the fact that the Trump administration has been incompetent in dealing with the pandemic, good, it proves the federal government is incompetent and you don't need them. People don't have so much of a lack of faith in state and local governments, right? It is the federal government which has the power to do big things. As for a variety of reasons, political and otherwise, that any big new social programs that costly have been vetoed by the right with the complicity of Democrats for the last 40 years. I think a lot of people are thinking like, yeah, well, what's the federal government done for me lately? Even if they think, yeah, well, I got Social Security, I got Medicare, I got all the things that they almost don't even think about as being big federal social welfare programs. But they after losing some faith a lot of faith in the 60s and 70s in the government and the power of government, reinforced by the right has also prevented the federal government from showing how essential and good it can be the way it was when everybody liked, whether it was Medicare or the space program or the interstate highway system, all these things. Like, wow, when we were rocking as a country, a lot of that rocking was the result of federal programs. And so by not having those new big federal programs, people go like, oh, what have you done for me lately? Yeah, sure, my mom gets Social Security, but otherwise,
Fair enough. Mary, do you want to bring in a question?
I'm just looking here. Someone's asking, is the patent system a consideration to be included in your thesis, the availability for individuals to innovate?
Yeah, these are Salisbury Forum attendees. These are great questions. Actually, patents are something I didn't know anything about, and almost entirely left out of this book because it was, along with several other things that were just like, okay, I've gotten pretty deeply into a lot of weeds. This was an extra set of weeds I didn't want to go deeply into, but there are problems with the patent system as it has been changed. There's problem in pharmaceuticals with the patent system. There's problems with the pharmaceutical industry in general, and how it's been how it is now treated by the government. The patent system is an interesting thing, and how my evil geniuses have used it to keep their large and small monopolies. I mean, the way that patents are extended by the entertainment business or by the pharmaceutical business on drugs, it does not, has all kinds of problems. It is not optimally tweaked to encourage innovation, is my understanding. But again, I'm even less of an expert on that than in the other things that I write about in Evil Geniuses.
Well,
Mary, do you have another question?
I don't have any other questions. Jim, Kurt, anything else you want to discuss?
I want to certainly conclude with reading something from Kurt's book. But before that, Kurt, can you talk a little bit about how you see China as a model for how America can pivot?
Yeah.
I found that quite interesting.
Thank you.
Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, thank you. You're the first person in 3 weeks of talking about this book who's brought that up, but and I'm glad you did. What China did in the late 1970s and the 1980s, which is to say, turn from this failing, dysfunctional, authoritarian communist state to this functioning, prosperous, taking hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, authoritarian state capitalist system, is extraordinary. And the amount of the paradigm shift that required to sort of give up communism, but pretend you didn't because we're still the Communist Party, it's maybe comparable, certainly analogous to what we have to do now, because I do think that the countries like Norway and Finland and Denmark and Sweden and Iceland and Canada, for God's sake, are doing free market capitalism so much better than we are, and so we need to pivot almost as radically, I think, as China did 40 years ago, and not
without the authoritarianism.
No, one hopes. No,
and one hopes, what may not be possible without that. So
what we're getting instead is the authoritarianism and the worst of the free market system. No, my fear is, and I've had this thought. I love Argentina. I've been to Argentina. I knew Argentina, and but we could become this giant Argentina. Argentina 100 years ago was on its way to becoming one of the great countries of the world. It was more prosperous per capita than European countries and Australia and so forth. And through a series of bad choices on their part, they regressed and became this dumb, bad, dysfunctional, less prosperous country, and occasionally authoritarian, military juntified country. No, that's one of the bad futures I see for us if we don't get out of this. And by the way, as you know, some of my hopefulness in this book is if we can do politically what's necessary to rejigger our economy, this future of AI and automation, super automation and 3D printing and all the rest, even as it reduces the number of jobs needed to be done by humans, that could be a great, fantastical society, whereas John Maynard Keynes said, the economic problem is solved. So it's a kind of double or nothing thing. We can have a gee whiz bang Jetsons future that is equal, economically equal, or we can have, road warrior. I mean, that's kind of the choice.
There's and Kurt concludes in his book with a wonderful passage from Walter Lippmann, who talked about how we had done this before. I mean, we, at the turn of when the 19th century became the 20th century, America was faced with challenges, and it could either become what it became or not. So Walter Lippmann was very pragmatic and in many ways conservative, but in no way utopian. But back at that chaotic, pivotal moment, he quoted Oscar Wilde's line that a map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at. In a real sense, we are an adventure. And as Kurt says in his last few words, so let's go already. So anyway, Kurt, I know Mary wants to say a few things, but I have to tell you, this has been a complete delight. And I'm now, after this, I'm going to get in my car and drive over to your house.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, I really want to thank both of you for joining us. It's been really interesting and fun to hear your comments. And I want to just mention to people, if they're interested, stay on. Briefly, we're going to post just information about our upcoming speakers, on this screen after we all say goodbye. So anyway, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everybody in our audience for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.